Okay, welcome back to another vid. I thought I'd do a music vid for the first time in forever. It's been a long time, but it's actually, I think, my 30th. The 30th music vid I've made. It's just, like I say, been probably a couple of years. I mean, I know I do them on the vlogs, the Friday brews that I do, the segment of what I'm currently listening to, but in terms of a standalone music vid, this is the first one for a long time. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. It's not really a pickups vid. I mean, obviously I bought these in the past, but I own so many records and so many CDs that, especially during these lockdown times, I thought a good thing to do for me, as much as I like making and watching pickup vids, I thought I'd actually just take a selection and listen to them for the first time in a long time, really, in some of the cases, and just give you my feelings. It's not a thorough review. Obviously, as soon as the video ends, I'll look back and I'll think, oh God, why didn't I say this, that, or the other? So don't take it with any real degree of, authority. It's not a definitive review that I'm doing, just a general feelings after listening to the album a couple of times over the course of the last few days. So, and then maybe in the future we can revert back to pick up vids. But really, I quite like the idea of doing this. It gives me an opportunity to listen to all this stuff behind me. Like I say, many of them I've had for years and not listened to for a long time as well. So I'd like to make them as eclectic as possible, so please don't think if this is the first music vid you've ever seen, and like I say, I've done about 30, there or thereabouts, don't think that you think you've necessarily nailed the music I listen to, because I might take you by surprise next time. So I've tried to make it a little bit eclectic, but maybe it's not enormously, but I guess you'll be the judge of that. So let's start off with this one. It's Café Bleu by the Style Council. Now, the Style Council, I'm sure you know, but if not, it's fronted by Paul Weller, of course, ex-The Jam. So this was the band that he formed immediately after The Jam. So, I tell you what, going back then, I mean, I'd have been a young kid when this came out, so I'd be lying if I said I could remember the impact it made. Far too young. But if you were a Jam fan, so think of mod revival, kind of elements of punk and rock, pop to a degree, new wave. If you were into that kind of mod revival scene and you really liked The Jam, and then you heard that a new album, a new band was coming out by Paul Weller, you were probably really excited. But then if you'd have bought this album, you probably would have been shocked, because this isn't mod revival at all. It's blue-eyed soul. It's a whole mixture of things. It's jazz inspired without question. A bit of pop in there, absolutely. But it's in honestly stark contrast to anything the Jam would ever have done. Although there's elements of it, really. Although with the benefit of hindsight, it makes a lot more sense now, I think, than it probably would have done back then. So, yeah, this is their first album, Café Bleu, although there was another album technically before called Introducing the Style Council, I think. But it only came out in a handful of countries. I remember reading it was Australia, Canada, where else was it? Holland, and a few others. And because it wasn't released, in the UK, then I think it technically doesn't count. Not just the UK, I don't think it came out in the US either. It was just a handful of countries, so that's why it's not really counted as an official album. And also, I think that album just has a handful of songs with a few remixes as well. So this is a proper song with proper album with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with 12 tracks on there, 6 on each side. So like I say, very jazz inspired, although Mixed Blessings and Miss Ship Came In, maybe not so much, but when it gets to Blue Cafe and the Paris Match, they absolutely have a jazz theme to it. Kind of, if you picture the scene of something like a French Parisian cafe, especially during the war, kind of a cabaret act, if you like. And it's sort of like that kind of style. If you're not into your jazz, it'll take a bit of getting used to, but it's really relaxed. For me, I find it anyway. I can sit back and put it on, I can listen to it, and really puts you in the mood. But when you listen to that, and the album really does get quite eclectic, especially when you turn on to side 2, which starts off with a song called A Gospel. And did I show you the back? Not really too much to see, I suppose. I'll maybe put a few other pictures up from the record that you can see if you're that curious. But A Gospel is, not jazz at all. It's almost, it is essentially a rap song, ultimately. Which is interesting. It just goes to show that the eclectic taste that Paul Weller had back then, wanting to ditch something so successful as The Jam and move on to something like this. Strength of Your Nature is a good track. You're the Best Thing is probably the most well-known track off this album, one of his more famous songs. And then when it gets to Here's One That Got Away, and then Head Start for Happiness and Council Meeting, the last 3 tracks on the album, that kind of reverts to a real sort of poppy vibe, 80s pop, albeit in a very kind of soul-y way, if you like, in a very Paul Weller style, rather than just general pop. But it's definitely more accessible, I think. As the album goes on, it becomes more accessible, becomes a little bit more mainstream. It's side A, which I think might either put people off or might take a bit of getting used to for newcomers. So the thing that I found quite funny about Here's One That Got Away is that Paul Weller formed the band with Mick Talbot, who was like the keyboardist, I think. And as soon as you hear Here's One That Got Away, my first impression straight away when I heard it, literally the first couple of seconds, is that it sounded like something from that Dexys Midnight Runners would make. It's that kind of sound with violins on, or maybe like a Levelers or the Waterboys. Many people have done it, of course, using violins in their songs. But it just sounded like Dexys Midnight Runners. And of course, this is 1984 this came out, so it's around about that time. And would you believe it, when I looked it up, and I didn't know this before, but Mick Talbot, he used to be in Dexys Midnight Runners, so that's clearly, I think, where that was inspired from. So it just made me laugh. So yeah, Head Start of Happiness is a really good song as well. And Council Meeting is just, even though it's a good song and it's catchy, it's basically an instrumental. And the best comparison I can kind of give is if you know the Housemarque song called Pirate Aggro. Was it Pirate or Pirates Aggro? Either way, from 1987, so obviously that came out after this one, then you'll recognise it. It's that kind of vibe to it. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Pirate Aggro was inspired by Council Meeting. So yeah, that's that. It's Café Bleu by the Style Council, technically the first album, although, like I say, there was one before. I really like it. I think it's good, but it does take a bit of getting used to. But as I say, it's funny how you can have side A, which is just completely different than side B, two completely different styles of music, almost in a way, a bit of an element, at least, of a concept album behind it, kind of. So let's move on to this next one. And it's a band that I used to love in the Britpop days, and they split up. Well, I say they split up. Technically, their last album release up until this one was 2001, but then I think they went away for a little bit, maybe for 2 or 3 years, and they came back and they started doing gigs. And up into more recent years, I think they were doing like Christmas gigs, especially. You know, I'm not saying that they turned into like a novelty thing. You know, like Status Quo do their annual Christmas gigs and all that kind of thing, or at least they did. I don't know if they're still going, of course, after unfortunately Rick Parfitt passed away. And is Shed 7, and it's Instant Pleasures. Came out late 2017. As you can see, this is the signed version, so I think it was on their website. They had pre-orders. This is going back to late 2017, like I say. In fact, actually, I think the pre-orders probably started about a year before that, and I got in there quite quick. It wasn't that much more expensive to get a signed one, maybe $10 or something. And I thought, yeah, I'd really like to get that. Why not? But then you had to wait the best part of a year for the bloody thing to come out. So, yeah, their first album since 2001's A Truth Be Told, and which I thought was alright, but I wasn't particularly enamoured by it at the time. I've not gone back and listened to it, so maybe in the future I will, and maybe even feature it on a vid. So I was really excited to get this. I was wondering, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be like a new style that Shed 7 are going to take on in 2017, nearly 2018 by the time it came out? Or is it going to hark back to times of old? And yeah, basically it harks back to times of old. And I think in a way that's the best thing I can say. Some may criticise that and say, well, they've never changed, it sounds the same. But I think that's a good thing. You know, it's a tried and tested formula. If you like Shed 7, you'll love this. In fact, within seconds of playing the album, when I first got it, and I mean literally within seconds, when you hear the hook of the guitar and the screeching kind of sounds, it just, of Room in My House, that's the first track on side 1, you instantly know it's going to be a good track, you instantly know it's Shed 7, and that's really the best tribute that I can make to the bands. Nothing to Live Down is a really good song. It's Not Easy, Said I'm Sorry, Victoria, Better Days. I can basically go through the entire album. It's a really strong effort and a very good comeback after being away for 16 years. The only thing I'll say is that there's a lot of songs on the album which are basically they're almost like anthems, slow burning. I was going to say sort of like not so much candle waving, lighter waving, but in this day and age, I suppose it would be mobile phones, wouldn't it? Or cell phones, call them what you will. And that's not a criticism as such, but maybe there's just one too many. If you think of Chasing Rainbows, that was a big song by Shed 7 back in the day, back in the late 90s. and there's just maybe one too many songs on this album that are like this. There's It's Not Easy, even though it's a good song, I did mention that. It's a little bit of a slow one. Let's see what else. There's Better Days, I think, could be definitely construed as one of those. And also Hang On, which is on side 2. But they're good tracks, but they're just maybe one too many. Maybe there's one too many slow songs on there. Songs Butterfly on a Wheel is a good rock song. It sounds almost borderline 80s in a way, which is a good thing. People Will Talk is a really good track, and Invincible as well. And Star-Crossed Lovers, I think for me, is the one which sounds, I don't know, a little bit like Suede in a way, kind of. It's probably, out of all the songs on the album, the most modern sounding one. But really, in all honesty, they still sound fresh. It's just that it harks back to like a different time. So, yeah, Shed 7, Instant Pleasures, a really good record and a brilliant comeback. And to have been away for such a long time, I think, to come out with something like that, it's a tribute, I think, to all the fans who love Shed 7 and love their earlier stuff. But I think it'll probably hook new people as well. So that's that. What I'll do with all these albums, by the way, I'll put one song, not necessarily the best, but just a decent one. I'll put it in the description box. So if you're curious, please feel free to check it out. So 2 more records and 1 more CD. And the first one, I feel a bit silly talking about this because in my last 2 vids full stop, or maybe 2 of my last 3, I'm not sure, I've mentioned Oasis. Now, I'm a big fan, always have been since back in the Britpop days. I was one of the early adopters to Oasis when they released, in fact, probably technically before they released their first single. I remember on my rucksack at school, like writing the names on the back. You know, I'm sure you did it with your school bag and your school books. You'd write bands' names and all that kind of stuff on there. And I remember having Oasis, the Oasis logo on there. So this would have been kind of like early, possibly late 93, but certainly early 94. And yeah, they hadn't even released a single by that point, but I'd heard them and I thought, what a band, amazing. And of course, we all know how good they ended up being eventually. So, oh, and by the way, a new single, well, is it a new single? Has it been released? I'm not sure, but a new song has been discovered by Noel Gallagher himself called Don't Stop. Maybe I'll put a link to that as well if you're curious. And I think that was found by Noel probably a few days ago. He was looking through some old unmarked CDs and he found that one. I think it's a demo which goes back to, my first impression, I thought it went back a lot earlier than this, but apparently, at least so I read, so it might not be accurate, but apparently it just goes back to sort of like 2006, 2007 time, there or thereabouts. But it sounds earlier, I'm not sure. But it's a good track. I think it was intended as a B-side, so if you listen to it, don't be thinking it's going to be the greatest leading single ever. It was just probably going to be a B-side, but that was one of the strengths of Oasis. They had really strong B-sides as well. So I really like it. It's called Don't Stop. Check it out if you're curious. But the album that I've been listening to in recent days, and I really like this, and it came in for a lot of criticism at the time, and it's from 2000, and it's Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. So I love the front cover as well, just that purpley blue kind of scene with the Empire State Building in the back there, and I'm sure the Twin Towers are probably there as well. So yeah, which of course 2001, so this was the year before. And yeah, I just think it's a really strong album. I think it suffers in the sense that, Oasis's better known albums and most successful, I suppose, even though all their releases went to #1, so they're all a commercial success, but people tend to think of Definitely Maybe, and of course What's the Story, Morning Glory. But I like all their stuff. I think they changed as the years went by. A lot of people say they didn't and they stuck to the same thing, but I think they did. I think they changed a lot as the years went by, incorporating different styles and different sounds. And if you listen to their albums as they progressed in chronological order, as the band got older themselves, particularly Noel Gallagher, who's writing 99% of them, then I think it definitely changes. Their style really does. And I like it. I was happy to go along with the changes at the time. I was never one of those Oasis fans that harked back to the days of Definitely Maybe or Morning Glory, which I love. Of course I do. But I was happy to see it evolve. And it never bothered me, if I'm honest. Maybe I'm a rare breed in that sense, I don't know. But that's how I've been. And I'm happy with their later material. I think it's decent stuff. Maybe not as good, but different. So it's hard to sort of compare. But when this came out, like I say, it was still a massive success. I remember the day that I bought it. I was working at Burton Menswear at the time. and the guy at work, the manager called Nick, he was a bit older than me, maybe about 10 years or so older, maybe not as much, but there or thereabouts. And he was like a family friend as well, as his girlfriend was. So I'd sort of known him since I was even like a kid, you know, when we first moved down Bournemouth way. So if I did anything wrong at work, I got away with it, basically. It was great because I knew the manager and the deputy manager and everyone. It was ridiculous. So anyway, the day that this came out, he said to me, I'm just going to nip on over to HMV. He says, I'm going to buy Stand on the Shoulder of Giants. He said, do you want me to get you a copy? Now, obviously, he didn't buy it for me. I had to pay for it myself. But I said, yeah, sure. So I gave him like 10, 15 quid, whatever it would have been for the CD. And he nipped off during working hours, despite being the manager, nipped off up the street and he bought it, came back, 10 minutes later or whatever, and took it home that night. And I just loved it. From honestly, the opening track, which is obviously a bit of an instrumental in itself, but I thought it was really good. Go Let It Out was a single. What else? Sunday Morning Call, Who Feels Love. I think those were the 3 singles off the album. Technically, Where Did It All Go Wrong was a radio single in America, but wasn't released anywhere else, I don't think. And that's a brilliant song. I love that. For me, the standout tracks, and not the singles, which I do like, but the standout tracks for me are Where Did It All Go Wrong and Gas Panic, which is just incredible. That wailing and the screeching of the guitars after around about 2.5 minutes is just so amazing. It makes, honestly, the hair on my neck and the back of my neck, my arms, goosebumps, just brilliant. Also as well, in particular with that track, and maybe this is why it's so nostalgic, but I remember going to see the band during their tour at Wembley Stadium. They did 2 nights in July. The second night, Liam was completely off his face. We didn't realise how bad his vocal performance was until we watched it back on TV the next night, because it was recorded for Sky One, I think. I seem to remember, was it Kelly Brook? She was presenting that with someone else, I can't quite remember who it was. And but we didn't care, at the time, with the atmosphere, the adrenaline's going on, there's 80,000 people all singing along and bouncing up and down. We didn't really notice how off his voice was, but it was an amazing experience to see them at Wembley Stadium. And yeah, I wouldn't change it for the world, even though the night before they were more, as a band, or Liam at least, was definitely more in tune. But I'm glad I saw them on that second night at Wembley, because it sort of typifies what Oasis were all about. It's that rock and roll swagger, the couldn't give a damn sort of attitude. And I'd rather have seen them that night than a much more polished performance the night before. But that, again, maybe it's just a personal choice. I saw them when I'd seen them before as well, but it was good to see them at this time, right, really living up to their sort of their rock and roll kind of iconic status. So anyway, I remember 2.5 minutes into watching them live when they were playing this song, Gas Panic, at Wembley Stadium. And I remember when those guitars started, that screeching, wailing noise. And I remember looking up at the time and seeing like the towers, the Wembley Towers. And I've just got that in my mind, burnt. It's like I'm there right now. I can see it. Like late into the evening, it must have been 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, if not later. And so pitch black, obviously the floodlights were on, of course, and all the lights from the stage, and 80,000 people. It's just an incredible moment. And when I hear that, it does take me back to that moment. But I love that song. Like I say, Where Did It All Go Wrong? When I first heard that song, one line has always stuck with me. And it's not really particularly poignant. I wasn't using it in relation to anything that was going on with me and my friends or my life at the time, but the line just stuck out at me. And it's, do you keep the receipts for the friends that you buy? And I thought, oh, I like that. When I heard it, I thought, that's a good line. Do you keep the receipts for the friends that you buy? It's a good one. I've always liked that. So yeah, that's a really strong song. And Roll It Over, I really love. It's a great ending to the album. It just sounds excellent as far as I'm concerned. There are a few what I would consider weak tracks. I can listen to them, but I would probably skip them more often than not. That's Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is and Little James. I'm not massively into those, if I'm honest. I can probably skip over those. The singles, Sunday Morning Call, Who Feels Love. I don't mind them. Go Let It Out is probably my favourite single. But yeah, they're kind of... I'll listen to them, don't get me wrong. It's not something I've got to skip. But I'm not hugely into them, to be honest. Like I say, for me, it's Gas Panic, Where Did It All Go Wrong, and Roll It Over. I Can See a Liar is a decent song. It's decent, But again, it's one which I'm sort of 50-50 over. It depends what mood I'm in. Sometimes I can listen to it, sometimes not. Slightly more punky effort. It's decent, but for me, not one of my favourites on the record. But yeah, anyway, there we are. Standing on the Shoulder of Giants from 2000, Oasis' fourth album, and it's a good one for me. I think it's very underrated, comes in for a lot of criticism. It did go to number one, as I say, as all their records did, but yeah, a little bit divisive. Especially for the people who just adore Oasis from the early period, where everything after Morning Glory just doesn't count. I'm not one of those people, as I say. I like all their stuff and was happy to go along with them as they evolved as a band. They will get back together. I think I probably said a long time ago, maybe, when I last mentioned Oasis in a specific music video, it might have been. I think I said at the time that it's probably not likely, but you never know, money talks and all that kind of stuff. But the more I'm thinking about it, with this new song being found and being, released, even if it's not physical release, maybe just released online for people to hear, with that and Liam talking about doing this gig for the NHS when we're all allowed to go to gigs again, and maybe getting the rest of the band together. Bonehead, I know, has expressed an interest in doing it. So it's probably inevitable, probably. And initially I was it's not that I was against it, but maybe selfishly, because I remember them back in the day. I've seen them live before, and I was there, I lived through that moment, and when they were huge, when they were starting off. And maybe selfishly I just kind of thought, well, I'm not bothered if they reform or not. But I suppose I'd quite like to see it. If given the choice, I do think it'll probably happen. Eventually, we'll see. Unlike The Jam and Paul Weller, who's never, ever had the slightest interest in getting the band back together again. I'd like to see that, I've got to be honest, but yeah, I don't think that one's going to happen. Sadly, another band or a solo artist that we're not going to see again. That's going to lead me on to the next one. Oh, it's such a shame when he passed away. This is an iconic singer. One of my nostalgic favourites. I just absolutely love this guy. Just absolutely brilliant. It's George Michael. And this album is Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1 from 1990. Just an outstanding album. So this was his second album, came after Faith, of course, which was a massive success all around the world. That was in 1987. This came out in 1990. And even though it sold really well, I think it must have sold in excess of 7 or 8 million albums around the world. So it was a success, but it wasn't as successful as Faith. So I think that's why ultimately Volume 2, you can see Volume 1 down there, Volume 2 didn't come out. I think Volume 2 was going to be released maybe the following year, the following summer, and it was going to be largely dance-inspired, where this is a lot slower. There's a few dance tracks on there, but it's a lot more soulful and a lot more mellow, a lot more mature. And I think it's deliberate because George Michael wanted to be taken, I think in his words, a little bit more seriously. He wanted to move away from that kind of, teenage girl kind of adulation that he had, and he wanted to kind of grow, I think, really, as an artist and be taken more seriously. So a lot more soulful songs on there with a lot more meaning, very powerful and emotional songs, starting with Praying for Time, which is such an amazing song. The lyrics are so poignant. Now, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a version of this song, Praying for Time, which George Michael did on, I think it was American Idol. Probably would have been about 10 years ago, there or thereabouts. And it's really good. Now, I think at the time, he'd not long recovered from pneumonia, I think, or he had a cold or something, which he did allude to after the song. He was like, oh, sorry for my performance, but yeah, I'm recovering from a cold. And yeah, you can tell a little bit. It's not the most amazing performance vocally, but it's the emotion that he puts in behind it, the passion, and it's just an incredible performance. It's really good, and lyrically, it's so relevant to what's going on today. I think it's one of those things which will always be relevant, talking about rich and poor and what people have and what they don't have. Very strong performance, very strong, powerful song, and obviously the album version is brilliant as well. So yeah, I think that's an indication as to how the album kind of really goes. Lots of passion in there, lots of meaning. This is not a boy or a young man anymore. This is a guy who wants to be taken seriously and who will be taken seriously after this album. So absolutely love it. Freedom 90, of course, is a dance track. That's really good. But then it goes back to something very kind of dark and somber with They Won't Go When I Go. And yeah, very dark song. Something to Save, Cowboys and Angels, Waiting for That Day. These are all kind of, the album does still have a few poppy kind of songs on, don't get me wrong, but it's predominantly that kind of slightly darker tone. Heal the Pain is like an acoustic number, very easy to listen to. Maybe lyrically it's quite dark, but it's quite accessible. I think most people would enjoy listening to that. Soul Free is a brilliant dance track. I love listening to that, so turn the sound up when you put that one on. And yeah, it's just a brilliant album altogether. It really is. And a classic, and it's just a shame, obviously, George Michael passing away on Christmas Day. So when you hear the song Last Christmas, I mean, out of all the time, it's never a good time to pass away, of course, but unbelievably apt, isn't it, really? It's just unbelievable. So, yeah, George Michael, Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1, never got to hear Volume 2. Maybe one day it will be released. It's a little bit like Trojan Souls. That was an album that was meant to come out in 1993, didn't in the end. I've heard bits of it. It was basically an unfinished album. And it was around about the time where George Michael was having his disagreement, shall we say, with his record company and with Sony and whoever else was involved. And the album never saw the light of day. But there's a few tracks which are finished on there, and a few which are like half finished. So it's sort of a glimpse, an insight into what that album would have sounded like if it had to come out in around about 1993. It's all online, so you can find it. It just to date has never officially came out. So anyway, that's enough of that. Brilliant record, and George Michael's just an amazing artist, one of my favourites. But moving on to something which is the polar opposite, really, of George Michael, we've got this one. Now, this is the deluxe edition. The album came out in 1991, and it's Nirvana, Nevermind. Now, I remember the day, I must have told this anecdote before, but I remember the day when this came out. Sorry, not so much the day when it came out. That's a slight lie. It was probably several months later, and then some on top of it. But I went to buy this, so I would have been 13 maybe, there or thereabouts, possibly 14. So it was after the album had come out, maybe about a year after. So 13 or 14, and this album was still huge at the time. And I went into Our Price Records. When it's at Our Price Records, I don't think they're around anymore, and probably haven't been for a long time. And I can picture the day like it was yesterday. I was wearing it was so appropriate for kind of grunge music. I was wearing a black and yellow checkered flannel shirt. And I was really small. I was quite a late developer in terms of, growing. So I was probably only about, I don't even want to guess, like 5 foot or something. It was ridiculous. So around about that age. And then I sprouted up, not to crazy levels, but I'm probably about 5'10", there or thereabouts. But at that time, so basically I remember being quite short because I could barely reach the counter, even at the age of sort of 13 or 14. And I remember handing it over, like the CD. No, actually that's a lie as well. It would have been a cassette. I handed the cassette over to the guy, and he looked down at me as if to say, like, how old are you buying this? So this is a bit too mature for you. How old are you? You must be like 10. But I wasn't. I was about 13 or 14, like I say. But anyway, I was desperate to get the album. I had several friends who had it. And I had a copied version, but I wanted the original one with the inlay, with the lyrics, with the pictures and all that kind of stuff. So I bought it from Our Price Records, took it home, and just listened to it just religiously for, days, weeks, months on end. It's an absolute classic. And what can you say? Starts off with Smells Like Teen Spirit, which is of course iconic. An iconic song, a brilliant video, a dark video, but a good vid nonetheless. In Bloom, Come As You Are, you can literally go through every track, and it's brilliant. I mean, even something like Polly and Something in the Way, probably the 2 tracks on the album that would be the last ones I'd listen to. I mean, Something in the Way technically is the last one that you'd listen to anyway, being the last track on the album. But yeah, I'm not massively keen on them. They're good, but not massively keen. I wouldn't go out my way to listen to them. But they're decent, but everything else is just brilliant. Lithium is an amazing, absolutely amazing song. It was, I remember the first time I heard it, and it was just so catchy. The chorus, Drain You, Lounge Act, Stay Away, On a Plane, brilliant start. And yeah, just brilliant. A real favourite of mine. And back in the day, it's funny because I was in my early teens, 91. In fact, I turned a teenager then. So, I had a very brief sort of flirtation with grunge music, which basically consisted of Nirvana and nobody else. I wasn't into Pearl Jam, 1 or 2 tracks, but I just couldn't really get into it. And even all these years later, to be fair, I've not tried to, but I kind of struggle with them. Maybe in the future I'll give them a chance, and maybe even listen to them on a vid like this and tell you what I think about it. But yeah, basically it was just Nirvana. They were the main, or pretty much only grunge act that I really liked. And it was around about the time that I loved Guns N' Roses as well. But then that really changed quite quickly in around about early 92. I discovered like indie music and alternative music. I'll talk about that in the future, which then led on to Britpop. So really my flirtation with this kind of music was very brief, but I did love it at the time, I really did. So another thing I'd say on this deluxe edition, you've got a stack of extra songs. You've got live songs, you've got B-sides, Even in His Youth and Aneurysm, I remember being B-sides to the singles Smells Like Teen Spirit. They're really good songs actually, and I think they almost made the cut to be on Nevermind, but ultimately in the end they did become B-sides. What else is there? Sliver, a live performance here, that's a really good song. And yeah, got some other ones. Sappy, I remember quite liking that one. Pay to Play, which is basically Stay Away, but just with different lyrics and a slightly different sound to it. So yeah, some extras. If you're a big fan, it'll be nice to listen to those if you're into that kind of thing. But just the album is just iconic, isn't it? Absolutely brilliant. And like I say, compared to George Michael, maybe it's the polar opposite. So there we are. I just thought I'd make a quick vid and talk about 5 albums, 4 vinyl, 1 CD that I've been listening to. And maybe I'll make another one in a couple of weeks. Maybe if I do them kind of every 2 weeks or maybe once a month. And yeah, but I quite like this style. It'll be interesting to see when I watch it back. It might be dreadful. But I like the style of picking up a few CDs from the shelf and just listening to them, vinyl as well. Maybe ones that, like I say, I've not listened to for a long time. It's better as well on the wallet than going out and just buying a dozen albums that I really want, but then not really getting the chance to listen to them. So I think this is probably a good way to save money and to really appreciate records and CDs as well. So until my next music vid, which might be a couple of weeks away, there or thereabouts, my next actual vid will probably be sooner than that, I imagine. But until then, thank you very much for watching. And if you're into any of these bands, if you're a fan, or not, you know, don't feel bad telling me that you think they're rubbish. If you're not into them, you're not into them. But you know, maybe tell me why, rather than just say they're rubbish. Tell me why you don't really like them, or give me some ideas as to what you're listening to, and I might check them out next time. Anyway, thank you for watching. Take it easy.